I'm looking at Tom, who's looking at me.
I don't want to comment on that specifically, but I did want to comment on a couple things that my colleagues are saying here. One of them, actually, I like what Professor Rich said about some of the urban renewal and sort of approaching some of the problems that are occurring from an inside perspective. I mean, Obama definitely had a pulse about the city, and he definitely took that to the White House. With that, I think other people saw that a lot of his other programs, the fiscal stimulus, healthcare, financial reform, when these came up, I mean, people thought this is another example of big government being big, right? This is another example of government putting their stamp on things that is inappropriate, right? We should let the market take its course and just let the market work, which is, I think that, and there's anger that's associated with that, and people think about, big government, and a lot of the anger, I think, stems from a misunderstanding about how markets work. And I mean, we hear things like the invisible hand, and we think that markets are magic. Think about a market like an orchard of fruit trees that gets a fungus, all right? People who think that the government shouldn't get involved would say, look, you have a fungus on some fruit, let all the trees die except for the strongest trees. Those strongest trees will survive, and then in the future, we will have a strain of trees that are resistant to fungus, and then we'll have stronger markets, we'll have a stronger fruit, except for that doesn't mean that they're resistant to frost, or it doesn't mean that they're resistant to high winds. It means that they're resistant to that fungus at that moment. And then guess what? You have less fruit. And the outcome is you've got some really strong pear trees, but you don't have enough pears to feed the city. And so I think one of the ways that people forget about how markets work is that when you have markets, they don't correct themselves in an instant, especially if there are huge transaction costs. Additionally, the only way that markets work are for governments to enact legislation that allows for private property rights and to basically pursue the infringements upon your private property with someone else. That means you need a government to enforce your private property in order for you to have a market in the first place. But nobody's upset about the policeman coming and trying to protect your house if someone's breaking in, right? It's like your house is burning down. They don't say, only send one fire guy, right? I mean, if their house is burning down, you'd like to see 15 fire trucks, right? That's big government, but nobody complains about it. People use this whole invisible hand in market works to sort of wipe away the fact that there are transaction costs, that markets are messy, and that you need governments to correct imbalances when they occur. Markets are messy, and when you have a president who's been involved in sort of urban policies, living in an urban environment, understands that markets just aren't smooth, you're going to get some big policies. I think the policies are terrific, and in absence of them, we would have had an even larger recession. But I mean, people just sort of gleam over that and say, "Oh, let the market work." Yeah, except it's messy. I mean, a lot of people suffer when you don't pay attention to markets.
Anybody else want to add a comment?
I think that's a good point there. Partly, I saw that in work in the Midwest in the 1980s. I was covering the Midwest during the Reagan administration, and that was the attitude toward the family farm. And President Reagan, doing what he said he was going to do, changed the rules of the game regarding government subsidies. And it's as if the tablecloth was pulled out from under the Midwest, and family farms were collapsing left and right. Farms that had been in families for 100 years were shuttering. Truly tragic stories of farmers, going out to the to the barn and killing themselves, or sometimes taking out their banker with them. It was right. A very difficult time, and in the end, hundreds of thousands of acres ended up being owned by Prudential Insurance and John Hancock, and the farmers ended up being sharecroppers again. It worked.
Yeah, I would just qualify, what you said in one way, which is that I don't really think that what's going on right now is that people are really angry and frustrated at excessive government regulation and big government. They're upset and frustrated at the fact that they don't have jobs, and their kids can't find jobs, and they're having trouble making ends meet, and things like that. So.
And their kids have moved back home with them, making them really frustrated and angry.
Exactly. So I think that what the anger and frustration is coming from for most people is more the way they're experiencing the economy, and it's hard to convince people under those circumstances, that the stimulus really worked, and things would be a lot worse if it hadn't been for that. And even though I think that's true, that's a hard case to make to people when they don't feel the benefits, they don't see the benefits in their own lives.
And I think the part of that that's actually really important is that that's not what Barack Obama sold people in 2008. And I think they're actually very angry with what they thought they got and the bait and switch that they think has happened. Look, there are certain things that we think about. I think we have already romanticized, and we did this on November 5th, 2008. We already romanticized what Barack Obama was. There are reasons why this man got elected. One, Democrats were advantaged in 2008 because people couldn't stand George W. Bush. So that was already going to predispose the country to elect a Democrat, regardless of who it was. Given the fact that they hated him that much, it opened the door for non-traditional Democrats to be able to make viable runs for president. If George Bush had been better liked, chances are Hillary Clinton or Bill Richardson would have stayed out of that race. But this now allowed a chance for minorities and women to be able to make serious and credible runs for the presidency. And then on top of it, you have the economy implode in the middle of the campaign cycle, and you watch the Republican presidential nominee suspend his campaign for reasons that made absolutely no sense to anybody else. And so people just completely lacked confidence in a party that they already had lost confidence in. If that perfect storm of events had not happened in 2008, or leading up to 2008, it is highly unlikely that Barack Obama would have been elected president. So he was elected on this change mandate, and he exuded a sense of confidence that made people really confident in his abilities, despite the fact that naturally people may have had some reservations about somebody who was as young as he is and somebody who was as black as he is. So that being said, now that we're here in real life in real time, you are dealing with a president who, like everybody else, is flawed. There are folks who will question his intelligence and his birthright because they were naturally predisposed to have those types of prejudices. That being said, this is somebody who isn't 50 years old and who hasn't had a whole lot of experience running anything before, and you're having the natural learning curve that's being involved with being president. So to answer the question of whether he should have gone on The Daily Show last night, not 100% convinced that would happen. First of all, I think television shows don't vote, and I don't think it's good mobilization. So not only are you preaching to the choir, I don't think anybody's going to turn out and vote because they saw him on The Daily Show. And I think it's doubtful, given his performance last night from the stuff that I've seen in clips, that he persuaded anybody who wasn't already persuaded to vote for him. So in that respect, it was cool for pop culture, but it really wasn't important for anything politically. The overexposure does lend itself to him being more of a show horse, and not a workhorse. And I think that that is something that he has to be very, very mindful of, not only because of his youth, but also because of his race. And so this is one of those things where you still have to deal with the stereotype of having to be twice as good. And I think people assume that because of Columbia and Harvard Law School that he was smart, but there are things you don't learn in school, and he has not quite picked up on that yet. His counterparts who lead states and cities have also not picked up on this, and it's usually those types of rookie mistakes that are getting them in trouble because they don't seem to know how to manage the politics, and they also don't know how to manage their personnel in ways that will actually make things effective to help get stuff done. So if Larry Summers is too busy running the show and he's telling you to do the wrong thing and nobody can tell him to shut up, then you end up with a problem.
Well, that leads, Michael wanted.
Yeah, I just want to, again, zoom out a little bit and encourage us to kind of look at a longer time horizon here and go back to 80 and Reagan's election. And I mean, that was really a watershed moment. And I disagree with Alan a little bit. I mean, I still think that there is some of this big government, big regulation sentiment fueling the current election cycle. Healthcare reform was seen as, big government. The stimulus thing is big spending, even though people people are forgetting we were in a desperate economic situation that required that. But the model has been, for much of the last 3 decades, let's get government out of the way, smaller government, less regulation, that'll fuel growth, that'll generate jobs, and that'll increase prosperity for Americans. If you're in the top 1% of the income distribution, that policy works. If you're in the top 10% of the income distribution, it works reasonably well for you. If you're in the rest of the 90% of the income distribution, that has not worked for you at all. And the problem is, as I see it, there's no counter-narrative to that. The symbols and the imagery of big government is what is really constraining the range of candidates and the range of policy choices that are there. And there's nothing coming from the other side talking about the importance of investing in human capital and providing the kinds of supports that allow markets to flourish and work for all. I mean, there was some of that in the 2008 campaign, and some of that reflected in Obama's urban policy and the like. But for the most part, that counter-narrative is not being articulated, and that gives, through the radio stations and the other kinds of outlets that the right has, it just allows them to perpetuate this notion of big government and we're a big spending nation, when you look at the actual statistics, we're not. But that's not being said.
Yeah, I don't really disagree with that, except that I would say that, I mean, what you find when you look at survey data is that there's often a contrast between those sorts of negative views about, quote, big government and in the abstract, and the fact that large majorities of Americans often support specific government programs and want government to do more, actually, in many areas. So it's not that clean a picture. I want to add something to what Andra said on Obama's success, and certainly I think the political environment of 2008 was a big factor in that, and although I think basically any Democrat almost certainly would have won in 2008. But there's another thing going on here, and it's a longer-term trend that's going to remain in place for quite a while and affect not just affect both parties and affect the outlook for future elections, and that's the demographic changes in the American population and electorate. And there's no doubt, Barack Obama could never have been nominated and could never have been elected if the demographics of the United States in 2008 looked like the demographics of the United States in 1980 or 1988 or even 1996. But the fact is that the non-white share of the American electorate has been increasing steadily and will continue to increase. That each succeeding generation entering the electorate is going to include a higher percentage of non-whites. And of course, Latinos are the biggest component of that, but the African American and Asian share is also going to increase. And without that, and of course it has a particularly a big impact on the Democratic Party, because the overwhelming majority of non-whites, and especially African Americans, are Democrats, and they vote in Democratic primaries. So that was a big factor in Obama's victory. Don't forget, Obama lost the white vote in 2008 by about 11 million votes, okay, which was about the same margin that Al Gore lost the white vote by in 2000. But Obama won the non-white vote by about 21 million votes. That was his margin, not the number of non-white votes. That was his margin among non-white voters. That was obviously key to his success, and of course it was also crucial to his success in the primaries, where African American voters were crucial to his success in many states, especially in the South.
So you're picking up on a point that Andra was making about turnout, right? So if we're looking at the importance of voters of color, and Andra said, well, if I'm going to call, it's a week before the election, it may be a little too late for 2010, but what might you suggest or have the Obama administration think about in terms of making sure that there's turnout? Because the voters of color could just stay home. It's not that they're necessarily running to the Republican Party, they could just stay home.